All right, welcome again, everybody. This is another of the UX UI AI interviews where we talk to designers and other folks in the sort of product design space that are working with AI or AI adjacent tools. And today I'm really happy to be talking with Ian Johnson.
Hey,
Hey, yeah, so thanks again for deciding to chat with me. I'm definitely really interested in talking a little bit more about latent interfaces and how you're working with building tools to sort of visualize data and sort of understand data better. But before we jump into that, can you talk a little about your history, sort of how you got to where you are today?
yeah, be happy to. I've been thinking about it, before joining today's chat, and I realized I've been sort of coding professionally about 20 years. I see myself as a programmer, prototyper, and with kind of a specialization in data visualization. But yeah, I kind of knew when I was a kid, like somebody in a after school class, like found the computer and was like asking the teacher about it. And I was like, what is that? Like, I need to be able to do that. And it was like I don't know, almost like a graphing calculator program probably. And since then I've kind of known like I want to know how to code. The more I learned about it, the more I was like, yeah, like if I can do this, I can express anything kind of. But one of the things that I thought I would share, because I think a lot of people watching this are people getting into the field, right? Or students or people switching, and is to share a little bit too about like the failures along the way, like the times I didn't get to do what I wanted. And the first one was actually in middle school, and I got to do like an after school program where we're going to learn programming and build your own computer. And I was super excited. Um, but I just couldn't get it. Like I couldn't get the coding stuff. Like I couldn't. And the mentor was kind of like, look, I think you need to learn a little more math before you can really like get some of these things because we were trying to do graphics, like make a game of Pong or that kind of thing, right? Um, and I spent the next 3 summers. I still went back to that same. It was the Magnet Lab in Florida, but I was actually working microscopes, and this kind of does come back to today. But going out, getting pond scum from the pond, putting on slides, looking through state-of-the-art microscopes at the time, and taking pictures. And I did that for 3 summers until he let me try again for code, like with the coding. And I was learning Java, and I had taken some math, um, and it worked that time. Like it stuck. I got to make some applets, and they actually work again now. It's like I think in 2007, the iPhone, like Java stopped working on the web for everybody. But recently I saw like old New York Times graphics are back, and I checked, and I can actually look at simulations that I helped make of like how scanning microscopes work or something like that. So, but this idea that like I wasn't good enough at math kind of comes back a couple times in my past, but I've always liked math. Like in school, I did decent. Um, and I did Mu Alpha Theta, like the math competitions. I never really won, but um, I actually I did my undergrad. I said I love programming. I knew I was going to get into it. Did computer science, my major. Hated the program. They wouldn't let me take the classes I thought like that would help me, like data structures and stuff, if I didn't do a bunch of like intro to C and like all these other things. So I switched around and ended up doing applied math. Um, and ended up learning how to do stuff like write an optimizer, like all the optimizers that are power all machine learning algorithms now. Like I wrote some simple ones in Python, and then even I accidentally took a class, a grad school class, where we coded BFGS, like one of the harder ones in Fortran. Like um, anyway, so did a lot of coding, did a lot of math, did an internship at Berkeley national lab and their supercomputing thing on visualization. Um, Before I left, I took the qualifying exams for a PhD at Florida State still, and it was a scientific computing department, which was a very interesting department because it mixed scientists from all different disciplines, and then basically everybody, all the different disciplines have some kind of computational needs. And everything we were studying was like linear algebra, parallel computing, all stuff that would, after 2011 be really important for machine learning, or deep learning, I should say. And I failed my qualifying exam. I did good on the programming, but I failed the math again. So I ended up during my internship at Berkeley, going to a random hackathon, joining a random team, and doing a data viz project and like using some web tooling like Canvas. And my teammate was like, "Hey, you should interview at the startup I worked at." I did. I got that job. I showed up and they're like, "There's this new library called D3JS. Like, we think we need it to build some visualizations. Can you like figure it out?" I was like, "I'll try." And I ended up really getting into it. It's really hard to learn D3, I thought. So I, joined the mailing list. Some people were like, "Hey, let's get together for coffee." Ended up starting a meetup that grew and grew and grew. We ended up hosting on conferences. And I think there's like some more stuff like, so with D3, like data viz has been my specialty for about 10 years. But what would happen is like, at that first company, you're trying to learn a new technology, and it's not just like, oh, I got to learn D3, I have to learn what these functions do. It was also like, you have to learn what SVG is, scalable vector graphics, and like you have to learn browser sandbox and networking. You have to learn like HTML and CSS, and it ends up being like there's so many things under the surface that it's hard to just be like, well, how does this work, right? Because like this thing touches like three other things. So I ended up making like, I don't know if you or your students have heard of Brett Victor, right? Worry Dream. Inventing on Principle is like still, I think, a really relevant talk. I recommend everyone watch. That was basically like our tools aren't good enough. Like we pretend to be computers. We try to like, we act like a computer to code, but really like we should make our computers do some of the being computer for us. And one of the ideas was that, you instantly get feedback, like if you're changing a number in your code, that it reruns the code without you having to like alt tab and recompile and do all that stuff. So I helped build a prototype. Like I built a prototype with a friend at that company of we called it Tributary. It was like a web-based thing. We could do some JavaScript, have some like any variables you had. We get little sliders. You could instantly see like it was really nice for visual code because like you're rendering stuff and then you're changing parameters, and that's driving most of your output. So like not having to like type made it much more expressive. Um, the startup ended up, you know, fizzling out or burning out or whatever you want to say. Uh, but I ended up continuing doing D3 stuff and joined another startup, which was an HR startup, so not machine learning, not even visualization. Um, I thought though, like I've learned all this stuff that's supposed to be like super powerful. Like, is it though? Like if I try to be useful, like solve some problems directly, like, and I worked with great product designers, product people, learned a lot about design. So even though I wasn't doing ML or data viz, like I feel like that was a huge benefit to me, like that I could take um, forward after that. So after that, I ended up joining Google and in the cloud uh, design team actually as a UX engineer. And I think I still kind of like that title, like the idea that like, my focus was prototyping. I worked with designers to try to make like ideas for interactions or things tangible so that you could actually like have we called it like anchoring a conversation. Um, and then I did that for about 4 years. But while I was there, I got really lucky, honestly. I sat on the same floor as Chris Ola and Sean Carter as they were coming up with Distill, right? The Distill.pub, and got to collaborate on several articles with them, just doing a lot of data viz, but having people patiently teach me machine learning concepts. And so that's where I learned all about like latent spaces and embeddings. And that was in 2018, or no, 2016 was when I first started with them, 2017. Um, and then it's like if you had Google Compute, or I had free access to cloud servers, so I could spin up machines with GPUs, like you could generate embeddings, or you could make, use uh, variation autoencoders, like. But I say that like, one of the things that's interesting is like I've been actually really interested in that, the potential of that, and now it's even more exciting. So like after Google, I went to Observable where I did mostly data viz and tooling. But then last year I started Latent Interfaces. It's say more of like a consulting, like I'm uh, freelancing and I'm actually working on an open source project I hope to release next week. So maybe 4 people see this, hopefully. But that's again related to like embeddings and visualization. So sorry, that was a long story, but
No, no, that's great. I mean, it's funny because I was trying to remember when I first started following you on social media, and it must have been during the Distill period because I was so excited about a lot of what they did, a lot of the visualization tools for the reverse engineering and machine learning models. And that was right on the time that I was trying to learn machine learning. So, like, seeing that stuff, I was like, oh, this actually helps sort of break it down, explain it. I also thought Distill and some of the like articles they had were just like wonderful instructional tools for people. And I think, like, then I think I saw you move to Observable. Like all of those tools were sort of meant to like, I think you mentioned Brett Victor, which is a great example because actually someone in our class, Erica, just brought up um, a video that related to his sort of the ladder of abstraction sort of thing.
Mhm.
Like all these
Mhm.
things kind of commingle in a way that is like, it's about trying to explore and understand and design all at the same time. And I think like tools that allow you to do that are probably going to be the future, especially within machine learning, where these spaces are so abstract, but also like the only way to understand them is to explore them. So then you
Yeah.
need exploration tools that then can synthesize things that'll then allow you to build off that, right? And I think like that's where I'm so fascinated, like seeing a lot of your work, and the stuff you're working on is really sort of the mix of all those things. And I think it's, you know, because I am teaching a lot of designers in this course, it's difficult because they may not have that programming background, but they do have some of the visualization background. So it's how do we like marry those ideas together? And I'm interested, you coming from a programming background, you said you really enjoyed like meeting with designers and UX people. Like, do you have recommendations on how to collaborate with folks like yourselves, on the design side?
Yeah, I mean, let's see. I mean, yeah, I'm trying to think back. Like I've worked with some amazing designers, and a lot of like on my side, what I think helped the collaboration a lot was being able to make quick artifacts or tools that could then be like not discussed theoretically, but discussed like, you know, is because if you have something in your hand, you can say like it would be better if it was this or that, or like less this or more that. Whereas if you're like, especially with data viz, and I think especially with machine learning, you may have an idea or a vision of like what's possible because of like what you've seen, what you played with, what you've explored, but like nobody else can see it because like, and that I ran into this all the time with data viz, like especially, I mean, every company I've worked at is like, you try to pitch the thing, no one gets it. Like they just can't imagine it because it's like, it's particular to the data. It's like a new way of looking at it. The whole point is that you are trying to like get to look at it and see if you see a pattern, right? So like you can't like describe a pattern before you see it. And And so what always ended up happening is like if I were to be able to build something that was, even if it was janky, even if it like only worked on my machine or in like a particular way or whatever, if it worked at all, then someone would be like, oh, like then people could say, oh, I get it. Like it should have, more data. It should show more of this or less. Like if it had also, if you could combine it with this stuff over here, then like it'd be super useful for someone. So like, so making something real is extremely powerful. Um, and then if without being able to code though, I still worked with a lot of designers that would make like something real doesn't mean like something fully functional or working. Like a lot of time, a lot of prototypes are like, you know, smoke and mirrors in a way, but like it demonstrates. So using modern design tools, Figma, what have you, like still making something that people can like anchor the conversation with, and then working with someone who can make functionality. Like I think a lot of times what I find so like the best designers I work with are like really good at like focus and clarity, kind of like being able to articulate this is what's important, or having taste of like being able to experience something, click through, try it, and be like this is what's making it hard to understand, or like the important thing, because what a developer, like what I'll tend to do, is still do is like I just put everything on the page. And I had a friend, he called it developer mode. It's like it could be an interface with like all like no CSS, essentially just like drop downs and everything, no padding, no nothing. Like, but if you know where to click, it works, right? And but the knowing where to click is definitely not a given. So yeah, it's like being able to focus on what's important. And like what I try to do is in my prototypes, focus on like the functionality that's important. So it's like, okay, like, because a lot of data stuff, and I think maybe one of the challenges with, working with machine learning stuff is working with real data. It's like, I mean, in data viz, this comes up all the time, but basically I won't work with fake data. Like um, it's just not going to be helpful. But with machine learning, it's like all the value comes from the data set, right? So, I mean, more or less, right? I say, but it keeps being shown that the better the data set, the better the model. Like, also, if you're applying it to some problem, then like the data set is the whole point. So being able to work hands-on with data, I think would still be like I'd recommend having ways to do that. And like I don't know if it's cliche by now if everyone just accepts this or not, but like I use ChatGPT every day. Like I grew up in a time, obviously, and like all of us did because it's only been a year since GPT-4, but like I memorized a lot of D3's API. Like I've like coded hundreds of D3 bar charts from scratch almost because like I knew I would keep doing it. Like I knew I needed to keep, and it wasn't always a bar chart, but like the patterns apply. It's kind of like your piano scales or something, right? And my wife's a pianist, like there's things that you do over and over so that your fingers can like you don't have to think about it when you do it. But like now, like the thing I'm about to put out is actually going to be a Python module. It'll be the first Python module I've ever published. I've written Python all point like on off and on for 20 years, but like there's so many things that which I think are the biggest blockers for like non-programmers is like what's an environment variable? Like where, what does this configuration mean? Why am I getting this error? Like these are the perfect things for ChatGPT to tell you like where to look and like what to change. Like, and that's what I remember learning Java 20 years ago. I was like, what is an environment variable? Why are these all capital letter things? And how would I even know what to put in it? And like, and it just won't work. Like I run the command that it says in the documentation and it doesn't work. And I have no recourse, right? Because that was I mean, Google was around, but there was no Stack Overflow. Like, so now I think it's like if you can, and what's super nice, what I'm finding is like a lot of these Python library, like with Hugging Face transformers and stuff, it's just like the code snippets you're copying are very small, and like, the data sets are big though. So having an idea of like your computing environment, but I mean, I don't have access to a GPU right now. Like, I mean, I have a Mac, M1 Max or whatever, like, but not like an NVIDIA GPU or CUDA or any of that stuff. And when I was recently, I worked at Stability AI for a little bit, and like they have a cluster, and I was able to run a lot of stuff without really knowing the the fine points, let's say. But I knew that if I had this SSH connection, I could run this kind of code, and like a lot of these things are pretty nice. They figure it out for you. So I think that having being able to get your hands in the data will be like the number one thing I would recommend, like finding a way to do that. Doesn't mean becoming an engineer or a data scientist or anything like that. It just means that can you download the data to somewhere that you can then count how many things are in it? Can you for loop over it? And then beyond that, you don't really need to do. But if you ask, ChatGPT, like for the pandas command to count the unique labels or give you a histogram, it'll just do it. So like I don't even know the panda syntax still, but like I know that I want to count these things or like filter by those things, and like those concepts, universal, working with data. Um, yeah. It's-
No, I think that's great because actually this week in this class we're actually looking at data sets and we're talking about, part of the requirement for these is you need to be able to understand the data you're uploading, or at least capture, collection, understanding it, and then using that to essentially train a model. But you're right, like the data sets have gotten so huge now that like downloading one of these things, it's like you're downloading terabytes of data. There's a JSON file you're like trying to read through, and it's so long, like half the things won't even open that large of a file. But yeah, you need an additional tool just to be able to sort of like look through that. I mean, I'm kind of interested, with your latent interfaces, what was the decision for you to go and become a contractor or like to help consult with people on basically exploring data? Like, what was the big moment for you where you're like, this is what I want to do, and um, take the leap to do it?
yeah, I mean, I think it's something what I noticed is that like there's there's a lot of people, companies, whatever, that are collecting data or running a process. Like a lot of this stuff comes down to like there's a process that's happening. It's been digitized, so like there's code that is like facilitating that process, and then there's data being recorded as that process happens, and like um and it's valuable, it's already valuable to have the process, right? The process lets, whether it's something like Facebook and people can share messages or photos, whatever social network, but like almost everything, like the startup I worked at was called Lever, it's HR software. So like you apply for a job, you're now a candidate in the system, you go through like a phone interview and an on-site interview, and you get an offer. Like that whole process at a lot of companies are just managed by spreadsheets and emails, and like you get really like, people fall through the cracks. You get people like getting miscommunication. So anything you can think of, like people will eventually turn into digital process, and then like, but then you have essentially like metrics or monitoring, like you can look into the process, and understanding like patterns in those processes can give you ideas for like, well, we could do this much better, or we could help people do it better, or whole groups of people are basically suffering because like they're running into this, and our process doesn't even like account for that. And like, so looking at the data, looking like often, I mean, that's what people call actionable insights, and it gets buzzword and all that. But like at the end of the day, it's kind of like, well, what's going on ah, that's interesting. Like, let's use that to change something. What I've found is that like, I mean, there's whole data analysis teams, there's all this stuff, but I think that there's like a number of really interesting data sets out there, really interesting processes that like can benefit, like that need custom interfaces to see those patterns, right? Because like, I mean, there's all these commercial and analytics tools and visualization tools, and they do a thing, they work, but almost always like the reason that you have a company that's growing and doing something is because you're doing something unique, or you're doing it like you're accounting for something that wasn't being like that wasn't a thing before. So being able to like incorporate whatever that is into the interface, I think I've found has been important. And I've always sort of avoided building database products because I kept finding that like in order to make something work in all these cases, you had to like dilute away the thing that worked for one case, and case by case. So I think that like to me, the most interesting and powerful interfaces are going to be custom made. And so, there's going to be some smaller amount of opportunities to do that. But I think those data sets are going to be really big, really valuable. Like it's going to be worth it to look closer. And that's, I mean, kind of what I'm finding too. So yeah.
Yeah, can you talk a little bit about some of the projects you work on? I mean, I read your sort of I think it was your Substack article about when you sort of announced that you were doing latent interfaces, and I know there was a project in there about like mapping the human genome, some other things you worked on. Like, I'm just sort of interested to hear like what you can talk about at least publicly, like what you're interested in or what you're excited about working on, and like maybe how you're finding working with basically new teams every time you start a new project, right?
Yeah, I'm still working with the Human Genome Project, or I mean, it's a researcher at Altius. It's an organization, like a scientific research organization, and I mean that's really cool because their research is a lot of like kind of there's a lot of genomics data, and for like the human genome, like um, and they've been developing these reference data sets where basically you can find patterns across the entire genome, um, and they have different meanings, or like they essentially provide context. And so what we're trying to do is that like there's a lot of papers that get published where it's like, okay, we looked at the 500,000 individuals, and we found that like this little snippet of the genome is correlated with this kind of cancer, or this kind of like developmental disorder or whatever. And then you're like, okay, like, but what else? Like, the genome isn't like a one-to-one program. It's like these things they fold up on themselves, do all this stuff, right? So by being able to say, okay, here's this snippet I'm interested in, like, what's some other context around that? It's like, oh, it's also like it enhances these kind of proteins, or it like regulates this stuff, and it's connected to these systems. Like essentially there's like a super high dimensional space, and trying to make a way to navigate that to like show the right context at the right time, the right scales. And it's yeah, I've been really enjoying like building an interface, and we're getting pretty close to having something that like it's like a URL that I could send you, and if you read some article in Nature, you'd be able to like be like, oh yeah, let me see what this region of the genome is like, what else it's related to. And then you and I may not be able to then make some scientific discovery, but hopefully, biologists would be like I would have them think of maybe new experiments or things to look at. And then I mean, part of that though has been like a technical challenge I've really enjoyed is getting, it's 3 billion base pairs in the entire genome. Like if you have one float per base pair of some kind of data associated with it, that's like 3 GB, making it so that you can like zoom in and out instantly to down to like GATTA or whatever, and zoom back out and like have meaningful stuff seen at like each level. Um, and it not being like sending gigabytes of data to your phone or whatever. So that's been an ongoing project. And then I worked for, like I said, a little bit with stability. I was doing like that was different kind of. It was interesting because they are developing a lot of APIs and models, and so like, and I think a lot of AI companies are sort of they'll develop models and then also like run them for you right through an API. And they were struggling with like designing their APIs, and I guess I can't. I started out because at the time David Ha was like their head of research, and he's the one who basically taught me what a latent space is at Google when we worked on a Distill article. And he was like, "Can you help like organize what's going on with these APIs?" And like, but then it morphed into working with the Clipdrop team on like prototyping interfaces to make like a fun one was like a sketch model where it's like draw a sketch and it turns it into a AI image. But what yeah, I mean, I guess I can't talk too in detail about one of the things that was most interesting and most uh, messed up in a way. Um, but I think what I'll say is that like the idea of using embeddings to understand a large data set um, is something that I found to still be like I'd been looking at that at Google. Like actually, my main project at Google was making an internal tool to like analyze usage of Google Cloud, which I think I can say this is just like a shit show of like hundreds of products. And there was stuff where it's like you can use like Google BigQuery with like App Engine and Firebase and all these things. And but people didn't know it's like, are people using those together or what, it's like they have all this tracking, but there was no way to look at like hundreds of products. So I ended up with working with a researcher and like back then we're using RNNs to like actually encode sequences of like URL visits to find patterns and like what are journeys people are taking. Um, and then visualizing that with t-SNE at the time. Um, and but yeah, I was realizing that yeah, it's like basically if a machine learning model learns anything, then whatever is learned is like captured in the embeddings. And if you can then look at the embeddings using something like UMAP, you might get a sense of what it's learned. And like even if the distill stuff and later the transformer circuits that Chris Olah and the team at Anthropic is still like pursuing, that's like model interpretability. But even without getting into like how the model works, you can still learn a lot about what's in your data set. Or if you have a new data set, you can just kind of, if as long as you know that this model like is capable of differentiating between these things, it can differentiate the data set for you. So the project I'm working on now, I'm going to open source it and hopefully use it as a base to do some client work because it's the tool I wish I had at Google and at Stability. Basically makes it easy to do a process of like, okay, embed a bunch of data, run UMAP on it, run a clustering thing on the UMAP, run like an auto labeling, either GPT, ChatGPT, or like an open source LLM to label the clusters, and then like an interface to look at all that and maybe compare stuff or sort it out. So yeah, it's like that concept of like that process, which I'm seeing like a number of like startups are offering like at least those 4 steps in a different ways. So I think it's like the time is right for this because models have gotten so good. Both embedding models are good and fast. So that's been really cool to see is that I can basically, embed 100,000, 500,000 pieces of text in a few minutes, like um, run UMAP in a few minutes, like on my computer, like I'm gonna don't need to do it in the cloud. I mean, the summarizing, the open source little models are still not quite as good as sending it to like GPT-4 Turbo or even 3.5 Turbo, like, but probably next month they could be, right? Uh, so yeah, I mean, I don't know if that answers the question, but
It does. No, no. I think what's so, I mean, you know, remembering my own experiences with Still and now hearing what you're talking about with these sort of tools, I think like what's fascinating to me is I think, and as someone who teaches AI tools to a lot of people across different areas of, their careers, I'm always fascinated by there's sort of two camps. There's one where it's like, I don't care how it works, I just want to see the output or the result, right? And even with machine learning people, I meet a lot of machine learning people that are like, I don't care about interpretability. It either works or it doesn't. And if it doesn't work, I'll go find something else that does. And I think what's so interesting is, I tend to gravitate toward the why or like the what's going on in here that like we can, learn something from that sort of thing. And I think that that's why I gravitate toward a lot of the tooling you're talking about are like trying to break down, like, here's what's actually going on inside the data set. Here are the clusters of things that clearly the model is learning from, that sort of thing. So I think it's, I'd say like I think we're sort of at this weird point in the machine learning world where everyone is moving so fast that sometimes the interpretability stuff gets skipped because it's easier to just make a new thing and say, well, the new thing works better than the last thing. So like let's just keep moving forward rather than trying to figure out like, but why is it working better? Or like, why did this thing not work and this one does? So I'm very excited for the moment. Maybe, I mean, who knows when it ever happens, but like where maybe we reach some level of like, okay, we can't really make these models better by just juicing it with more data, or we can't make it better by just throwing more GPUs at it. And we do really need to actually understand what's going on inside the model. And that's when I think like a lot of these tools will become like way more valuable. And we're maybe just waiting for that moment to hit, which might actually happen very soon. It sort of feels like there's only so
yeah,
much data in the world. Like, people started to work with artificial data, like that sort of thing. But like, I think we are starting to hit the place where it's like, okay, we actually should start to understand what's going on in these things and how to improve them based on what we know. And I think that's a world where these tools can be really powerful. But also, like, I think it's really fascinating just, with people just getting into machine learning or like getting excited about it. And I sort of show them, like, okay, here's how to scrape a data set. But like, how do you now know what's in that data set? Let's see, you've got 100,000 images. Like, what's actually in there? Because the reality is, like, you go through some of these open source data sets and the data in them isn't very good. Like, there's lots of like garbage in there, and yet the model still somehow works. And it's like, well, is that good or bad? Like, I don't know. But I do think more tooling around understanding what's actually in your data would be really valuable, to a lot of people who are not even doing machine learning, right? I think to your point of like, you know, every company that's a tech company today pretty much has data. And like,
mhm.
you know, you could hire a data analyst or a couple data analysts to help you sort of scrape it or like sort it, that sort of thing. But like a lot of the product teams I work on today, like, that data analyst is stretched very thin. So like
Yeah,
how do the rest of us go and like actually look at the data we have and begin to sort it by, those sort of things. Like I'm very interested in, I think you mentioned like ChatGPT 4, but like even basic like machine learning models that just do sentiment analysis. Like, hey, we got a bunch
mhm.
of feedback. How much of feedback is positive or negative? Like, even those sort of tools, which are now basically runnable, via any service, like whether it's your laptop or, another like cloud service, are really powerful. And it's like the easier those become, or the especially for designers, as we talk about, like, what's the interface for this thing? Is it just like an
Yeah,
upload and go process? Is it like an upload and then sort? Like, I think those are the sort of things that I'm very interested in seeing designers begin to take on, because it does show the value of all of these pieces put together. And I think you started mentioning this of like, there could be four steps. One company does step one and two, one company does step three, another company does step four. And it's like hard for people to piece those parts together. But if you're a designer, you sort of see like, oh, well, let's edit that all into one sequence, or like let's figure out the steps. We need to guide someone through it so they can begin to understand that stuff. And I think, you know, that is probably where, like, in many ways, is probably where the future of this sort of UX design world is going to go, is less like, hey, let's actually define the steps for the tooling, and more about like, let's actually guide a customer through a bunch of tools that they might not be aware of or they might not understand.
yeah, yeah. There's two things there that I want to respond to that are really I think salient. Like, well, the first part about understanding what's happening with machine learning and like moving fast, like there, I mentioned in the beginning, like I've run into these walls with math in my career, and like I've always really loved the quote, like von Neumann's quote of like, you don't understand math, you just get used to it, right? And there's like, I don't know, my mathematician friends didn't like it, but there's something about programming, like which is like a craft where like getting used to it, like a piano, like you get used to the scales, and then it's like it becomes something more like a feeling than an understanding, right? So you never really understand the thing, but like, and I think that there's room for that in machine learning. Like, and working with some artists and designers, I've noticed in grad school, I did a project with Blender, like the open source 3D rendering. I was doing particle simulation. I gave it to an artist, like a prototype, and he just dialed up the numbers like way past like the tolerance that I had in mind. And what ended up happening was like it still worked. It was slow, but it looked way cooler. And so it was, like the effect was like dramatic, and it was and that moment kind of proved to me too of like, you know, feeling things out, like just trying it yourself is super powerful, right? So even if you don't understand it, it's still a good idea to try it. And then that said, like I think part of understanding, like what I've taken away, working with the Distill folks, like interpretability stuff is like, and keeping like I can't keep up with the papers, but like there's definitely things where they're showing that like, a higher quality small data set can produce a model with like the same capabilities as like a model trained on bigger data. Like, so I think there's a lot of hope for like, well, if we can sort out what these pieces are, then we can like put them together more efficiently or like, um, but again, like coming back to getting your hands on the data, like being able to touch it, look inside the data, even if you're just looking at a few things or randomly or looping or filtering by something, using a similar, like what you said, the semantic or sentiment or something, like anything like that is good. Like anything that is like getting you to sort of touch the data, like I think has way more ROI of like your time than like the theoretic, like making sure you're applying like the best algorithm or whatever. And what I found over and over again is that like at Google, at the other startups I worked at, was that like often my first job is to just make sure we're counting properly. Like you can get into statistics, you can get into all the fancy stuff, but like if you don't know how many of a thing there are, then like what does it matter the likelihood that you have more things because right? It's like, and it's just so easy to like not be counting correctly. And like one of the more impactful parts of like the super advanced internal tools that we ship with all the T-SNE UMAPs and like clustering and stuff was just a page that listed the counts like authoritatively for every product so that like if your cluster did tell you that this product is like highly associated with this other one, you could just go see like these numbers and like the PMs on that team, they would know the numbers for just their thing and they would see it and they would trust it. And like, but so many times in analysis, you do across all these things and you didn't know that there's some special accounting going on there. Like, so anyway, the point is like all this fancy, exciting stuff is great. And, keep trying it and using it. And like, we're at like a point where there's so much to explore. But, like like make sure you're counting at like looking at things piece by piece and checking the answers because like I don't trust like there's an interesting thing where it's exciting that these models are so capable, but it's very obvious that you can't trust them to be deterministic either. So like it's going to be like a new paradigm too for like how you leverage the output to these things, right? And yeah, yeah, no,
Yeah, it's
that's
so
it.
funny because I was teaching a private workshop to a group yesterday, and everyone turned on the AI companion on the Zoom sessions. Um, and I wanted to see, like, I was hoping everyone would send me like what the actual output of those models was, because in past experiences, I've seen people run those. So then everyone has their own AI telling you what happened in that meeting, and the results across all of them are very different. And it's like we're at this point where, like, yeah, you almost have to run the model X number of times and then average those results to get the actual answer or something close to the actual answer, because they are so non-deterministic that they can pick up on certain things and sort of go all in on that. And I think like that's its own challenge, where we now are flooded with data, and then our tools that sit on top of it are non-deterministic and often giving us different results depending on the day we're running it. That now we also have a flood of answers, none of which are exactly clear about what the actual answer is. And again, these layers of abstraction that are keeping us sort of further and further away from these things, and we're not even sure if they're right. And that's I mean, that's just going to lead to, I mean, even on the generative side, right, it's the same thing. We're just getting flooded with imagery and other things, and it's going to be a challenge to sort of separate the good from the crap, and even separate the real from the unreal. Like it's a fascinating world where we're going to need layers of tooling to even help us sort that stuff out.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's why like using the generative models to help code is so powerful because you can check it, right? Like, I mean, if it tells you to do something that doesn't work, then you know it's not working. Like, I mean, more or less, right? Obviously, complex systems, like, but like, I still I look at generative stuff as like suggesting. Like, it's really helpful to like search and suggest and like categorize, but we should definitely like let people be making the decisions. With that. And like if you but and if you look at it from not but because I felt like a lot of assumptions. I remember even at Google the thing was like, oh, we're gonna have like AI driven cloud and stuff, and it's just gonna like auto deploy. But like that didn't happen. I knew it wasn't gonna happen because it's just you're not counting things right. So then you're gonna let it, spin up $100,000 worth of computers and now it's like you don't but you want it to tell you like, hey, you could save a bunch of money by like turning these off, but you have to decide, do you want to turn it off or, um, yeah. So I think it's still, and it comes back to like, it can summarize, it can uh, give you like focus your attention. But then when you do focus your attention, you should be looking at the real thing. Like what is it? And so like it just show you the data points or like, I don't know, like that's always been one of the design principles I've picked up on is like any data viz, like I should be able to get in the interface the underlying data, right? Like if I'm showing you that 33% of candidates like advance to the higher stage, like which candidates and like there's a table underneath and like that may not always work, but it's a principle. It's like yeah, I
No,
think
but I
still
love that. I love that as a principle, which is always like things are always grounded in, well, like here's the summary or here's the high level idea, but then also here's the data that backs it up, right? And I think like that is, really something we need to think about and plan for. I also think a lot about, the sort of the AI hype cycle right now is sort of like we're inventing self-driving cars, right? Like we are removing the person from the equation, when the reality is, I think like these tools are still essentially bicycles, right? They still need to be run by a human, where like the final step needs to be approved and like double checked against by someone. And I think like the hype cycle has made it seem like, oh, you can just trust these things and they'll do everything for you. When the reality is like it should still be guided by an expert as the final decision, right? So here's a bunch of assessment summaries from various toolings, but some expert is like using that as a way to like get enough insights for them to make a decision, but it still should be a human making that decision. I think we've seen way too many companies jump way too far in that cycle to go to just be like, well, whatever the machine tells us we'll do. And it's like, well, that seems problematic, or like definitely going to lead you down a weird path.
yeah, I think this is slightly tangential, but something I wanted to make sure to say is like, but it is like, people in the loop, like the other thing I'd really encourage everyone to do is to build community, like working with other people, learning with other people. I mean, Discord is like there's a million Discords now and like meetups, whatever it might be, like, but that's just been so important to my career and like not just career, but also like I don't know, happiness and like I feel like as someone curious, as someone who wants to like be able to do new things and share, like learn from others, share, like there's not always the community that you want already. Like I think I would say that too. It's like, you can start it. Like you can start the Discord server, you can start the meetup, start simple with coffee, like start simple with email a few people and be like, hey, like because it's like nobody knows everything, like especially in ML where it's just moving too fast anyway. But even if it wasn't moving as fast as it is now, even like 10 years ago, it's like the domains and disciplines required to like really make something, is not can't fit in one person's head. And like the thing that was nice about D3 was that it was like super obvious that like, you know, you need to be able to code pretty well to like make these charts and like work with the data. But like if someone was that good at web programming, they probably didn't have like the background in training and like data analysis or design. And like designers who were working on this stuff, right? Like, and so what ended up happening is that you'd like meet someone really good at something that you don't know that much about. And like, but they were really good, but they didn't know much about what, it's like, and I don't know if in other domains that like it's that clear, but I think I'm just gonna go ahead and say it is that way, right? Like, and my experience at Distill too was really nice. Like that, I mean, and those guys were like super smart, way smarter than me, but like, and they would get into some of the JavaScript, but it just was clear that like them patiently explaining to me what they knew well, and then me like trying to interpret that and make something, and then having a conversation about that, like like it sharpened some of the papers, like the terms that like they came out of like explaining to me who didn't know anything about that thing, helped them explain it better, right? It's like I forced sort of like that aspect to become clear, but like, yeah, all I'm saying is like this field is way too complex to like for anybody to be expert or like you know, I mean people can be experts, sure, but like the experts don't know it all, right? So we should find other people that we like working with, share our knowledge because like guaranteed, even if yeah, it's just there's so much the latent space is really big. Like it's gonna take a lot of us to explore it. Yeah.
No, I think that's a great metaphor for everything in life. The latent space is too big, and I think I think that's a great moment for us to wrap up on. But I really appreciate that, and I think yeah, you're absolutely right. Like this stuff is all too big for any one person to understand, and that's why I loved bringing in you and other folks to do these interviews because I've got a personal point of view on how I want to see this stuff built, but like I think lots of other people have other interesting ideas or like are definitely smarter than me in certain areas. And yeah, so I'm really happy we got to chat. And I want to thank you so much again for your time.
Yeah, man, it's been an honor. Yeah,
Yeah.
thanks for having me.